The snow had been falling on Toronto for 3 days when the boy pushed through the heavy brass doors of the Airy and asked, in front of 40 of the wealthiest people in the city, whether the man sitting alone by the window was the one his mother had told him to find. Nobody at the Airy was used to noise. 52 stories up, where the windows held the whole frozen sweep of Lake Ontario and the lights of the harbour blurred under the storm, the loudest sound was usually the soft chime of a wine glass being set down. So when the doors banged open and a gust of February air came spilling across the carpet, every head turned. A boy stood in the entrance with snow melting off his shoulders, his lips a bad shade of blue, one running shoe held together with hockey tape. He couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. In his bare red hand he was holding a photograph, and he held it up the way a child holds up a permission slip, like it was the only thing that gave him the right to be there. The man by the window was Harlan Voss, and at 61, he had long since stopped being surprised by anything. He had built half the skyline you could see from that table. People who didn't know him called him a developer, which was true the way calling the lake some water was true. He had started with a single salvage crew and a borrowed flatbed, pulling old-growth timber out of mills up north, and he had spent 40 years turning lumber into towers and towers into a fortune so large. He had stopped counting it sometime in his 50s, because counting it had begun to feel like a strange thing to do with an afternoon. He had a house in Rosedale with 11 rooms he never entered. He had a driver named Bishop, who had been with him longer than most marriages last. He had, on this particular Tuesday, a plate of seared trout he had ordered out of habit and was not going to eat, because the woman who used to share his meals had been dead for 9 years, and food had never tasted like much since. So when the boy crossed the dining room, past the maitre who said, "Son, you can't," and got an elbow shrugged off for his trouble, past a senator's wife who pulled her clutch closer, and stopped at Harlan's table, breathing hard, Harlan did not flinch. He set down his fork. He looked at the small wet face, at the way the kid's whole body was shaking and trying not to show it, and he waited. "Are you Mr. Voss?" the boy said. His voice came out thin and cracked. "My mom said if I ever had nobody left, I should find you. She said you'd know my dad." He turned the photograph around. It was an old print, the kind nobody made anymore. The white border yellowed and one corner soft from handling. 2 men in hard hats stood in front of a half-framed building, squinting into the sun. One of them was younger than Harlan had been in a long time, dark-haired, grinning, a tool belt slung low on his hips. The other was a tall fellow with a careful, kind face and a hand resting on the younger man's shoulder. Harlan's chest went tight in a way it hadn't in years. He knew that building. He'd raised it himself in the summer of 1991, a 6-story on Eastern Avenue that had nearly killed him. And he knew the man with the kind face, because that man had once grabbed the back of his coveralls and hauled him out from under a falling load of steel deck plate a half-second before it came down where his head had been. The man's name was Daniel Renault, and Harlan had not spoken it aloud in 30 years. "Where did you get this?" he said. It didn't come out as a question. "It's my dad," the boy said, "Daniel. He died when I was a baby, a different accident, not yours. My mom kept it." He swallowed. "My mom's Sylvie. She," and here the careful structure he'd clearly rehearsed on the long, cold walk fell apart, and his face crumpled, and he finished in a whisper. "She died in November. I don't have anybody. She said you were a good man underneath and I should come." For a moment the dining room held perfectly still, 40 forks suspended over 40 plates, and then Harlan Voss did the thing the whole room would talk about for weeks. He stood, took off his own suit jacket, and wrapped it around a stranger's child. He pulled out the chair across from him, and he said, not gently because he had never learned gentle, but plainly, in a voice that carried, "Sit down, you're frozen half to death. Whatever else is true, you're going to eat first." His name was Elias. Eli, his mother had called him, and so almost no one else ever had, which is its own kind of loneliness. He was 11 years old, and he had been losing his whole life one piece at a time for the better part of 3 months. It had started with the cough. Sylvie Renault cleaned offices downtown, on the night shift, the big glass banks, where the lights stayed on all night for nobody, and she had cleaned through the cough until the cough turned out to be the kind of thing you don't clean through. By the time a doctor at St. Mike's put a name to it, the name already had nothing to do but describe how fast. She had spent her last 6 weeks in a bed by a window that looked out on a parkade, and Eli had spent them in a plastic chair beside her doing his homework so she wouldn't worry that he'd fallen behind. He never did fall behind. He wanted that written down somewhere, that he never fell behind, even at the end. When she died, the systems that are supposed to catch a child caught him for exactly 19 days. A foster placement out in Scarborough, a kind enough woman with 3 other kids, and a husband who drank. A long bus ride to a school where nobody knew his name. And then a phone call. A paperwork problem. A temporary that became untemporary. And somewhere in the shuffle Eli simply walked out the door one gray morning and didn't go back, because going back felt like agreeing that this was now his life. He had $18 and his mother's photograph and an address scribbled on the back of a hydro bill in her handwriting. H. Voss, Airy, 52nd Flare, with no explanation at all, only the words she'd said to him in the hospital, over and over until he'd memorized them the way you memorize a prayer you don't yet understand. He had slept 4 nights in the stairwell of a parking garage on Front Street. On the 5th night, the temperature dropped to -26 with the wind, and Eli, who was smart enough to know what that meant, decided he would either find the man on the hydro bill or he would lie down somewhere and stop being cold the permanent way. He didn't tell anyone that part. He didn't have anyone to tell. So he walked into the lobby of the tallest building he had ever seen, and when the security guard moved to stop him, he said the only true sentence that had ever opened a door for him in his life. "My mom just died, and I have nowhere to go," and something in the man's face changed, and he let him into the elevator instead of out into the snow. Eli didn't know any of this would matter. He only knew he was so tired, and the soup that came to the table smelled like the kitchen of someone who loved you, and the old man across from him kept looking at the photograph and then away from it, the way you look at a wound. Harlan took the boy home that night. He told himself it was for one night. He told himself a great many sensible things in the back of the car while Bishop drove them north through the storm. That he would make some calls in the morning, that there were agencies for this, that a man his age with no children and no patients had no business with a grieving 11-year-old. He told himself all of it, and then he watched the kid fall asleep against the window, with his mother's photograph still clutched in his fist, watched him whimper once in his sleep and go still. And Harlan understood with the bleak certainty of a man who has spent his whole life being right about money and wrong about everything else that he was not going to make those calls. Because he remembered. He sat in his study until 2 in the morning, a glass of rye going warm and untouched at his elbow, and he let himself remember the summer of 1991. He had been 30 years old and reckless and so hungry to build something that he had cut corners no one should cut. The Eastern Avenue site had been a death trap, and everyone on the crew had known it. And the day the load came down, the day Harlan had been standing exactly where 1,000 pounds of steel decided to fall, it had been Daniel Renaud, a foreman 10 years his senior, a Métis kid out of Sudbury who whistled while he worked and brought extra sandwiches for anyone who'd come without lunch, who had moved faster than physics should have allowed and yanked Harlan clear, and taken a gash across his own forearm doing it that needed 19 stitches. Daniel had laughed about it afterward. "You owe me a beer for life, Voss," he'd said, and Harlan had bought him that beer, and a few more. And then Harlan had gotten rich, and rich men get busy, and the crews change, and the years go by. He'd heard, third hand at some banquet, the way you hear things, that Daniel had been killed a decade later on someone else's site, a faulty harness, a fall. He'd heard there was a young widow. He had meant to do something. He had told himself he would write a check, find the family, do right by the man who'd saved his life. He never had. There was always a deal closing. There was always a reason it could wait. And then his wife Eleanor had gotten sick herself, and his own grief had swallowed every other obligation whole, and by the time Harlan surfaced from it, the trail was 30 years cold, and he had let himself believe it was too late to matter. It was not too late. It had walked through his door in a taped-up running shoe and asked for soup. He found Sylvie Renaud in the public records before sunrise. Office cleaner. 43 at her death. A single death certificate. A single child listed. No next of kin recorded but the boy. He found the obituary the funeral home had posted for free because no one had paid for a longer one. 4 lines survived by her son Elias, predeceased by her husband Daniel. He read it 11 times. Somewhere in those 4 lines was a woman who had worked nights her whole life and had kept, through all of it, a photograph of her husband and a powerful man, and had told her son with what little breath she had left that this stranger was good underneath. Find him, sweetheart, find him. She had been collecting on a debt, not money, a debt of the soul, the kind that does not appear on any ledger Harlan Voss had ever kept. She had spent her dying weeks trusting that the man her husband once saved would not let their boy freeze. Harlan put the rye down the drain. He went upstairs and stood a long time in the doorway of the guest room, watching the small shape breathe, and he made a decision the way he had made every important decision of his life, which is to say completely, and all at once. In the morning he told his housekeeper, Maeve, who had run his house for 30 years and feared nothing, to ready the room properly, to find out what an 11-year-old eats, to buy boots. Maeve, who had watched this man harden into something close to stone over the long years since Eleanor, looked at him for a moment with her hands on her hips and then said, "About time something woke you up." And she went to buy boots. It would be a lie to say it was easy after that, because grief is not polite, and an 11-year-old who has lost everything does not heal on a rich man's schedule. Eli flinched at sudden noise. He hoarded food, slipping dinner rolls into his pockets out of a habit the streets had taught him in 4 short nights, and Harlan never once mentioned it, only quietly made sure there was always a basket of muffins on the counter that no one would ever count. The boy cried at night and pretended in the morning that he hadn't, and Harlan, who had cried alone for 9 years and pretended the same, recognized the strategy and let him keep his dignity. But there were good days too, and they multiplied. The boy turned out to be funny in a dry, watchful way that reminded Harlan painfully of his father. He turned out to read everything: cereal boxes, the backs of paint cans, a whole shelf of Eleanor's old gardening books, and Harlan started leaving books around the way you leave seed for a wild thing you're trying to coax closer. They watched the Leafs lose together, which Harlan privately considered an important part of any Canadian childhood. One Saturday Eli asked, very carefully, like he was asking for something enormous, whether they could maybe go to a Tim Hortons, a real one, because his mom used to take him after her shift on payday and get him a double-double even though he was too young for coffee and the Timbits were 10 for a toonie. Harlan, who had not stood in a line for anything in 20 years, stood in line at a Tim Hortons on the Danforth and bought 40 Timbits and watched the kid pick the chocolate ones out first and felt something in his chest he had assumed was permanently switched off. He started coming home for supper. The board noticed. Harlan had been a man who closed on Boxing Day, who flew to Calgary on Christmas Eve if a deal needed it, and now there were evenings he simply wasn't reachable, and the machine he had built groaned at the change. The loudest of the groaning came from a man named Curtis Ladd. Curtis was Sylvie's half-brother, though Eli had to be told this, because he had met the man exactly twice in his life, and both times Sylvie had gone quiet and hard afterward and locked the door behind him. He appeared 11 days after the story hit the papers. And it did hit the papers, because 40 wealthy diners cannot watch a billionaire wrap his coat around a street kid without somebody putting it online, and Toronto magnate takes in orphaned boy is the sort of headline that travels. Curtis Ladd read that headline in a basement apartment in Hamilton with a stack of collection notices on the table, and what he saw in it was not a child. What he saw was a door. He came to the Rosedale house in a borrowed blazer with a lawyer, 2 steps behind him, and he wept on the doorstep about his beloved nephew, his only family, taken in by a stranger, and he said the word guardianship the way a man lays down a winning card. Harlan let him into the front hall and no further. He had spent 40 years across negotiating tables from men far smoother than Curtis Ladd, and he could read the play before it finished. But he was careful, because the law is the law, and an uncle by blood outranks a man's good intentions in any courtroom in Ontario. "You're Sylvie's brother," Harlan said. "Half-brother, same mother." Curtis dabbed at a dry eye. "We were close. This has just devastated me, Mr. Voss, knowing little Eli's been suffering." "Where were you?" Harlan said. It was not loud. It landed in the hall like a stone dropped into a well. "Sorry? Where were you?" Harlan repeated. "In November when your sister was dying at St. Michael's. Where were you the 19 days he was in care? Where were you the 4 nights he slept in a parking garage on Front Street in a polar vortex?" He took 1 step closer. "Because I have looked, Mr. Ladd. I have very good people, and they have looked. And what they found is that you saw your sister exactly once in the last 6 years. that you owe $41,000 to people who are no longer asking nicely, and that you did not so much as send a card when she died. You found this boy in a newspaper. The same week I did. Curtis's mouth opened and closed. The lawyer behind him began, very slightly, to edge toward the door. Blood is blood, Curtis tried, but the words came out thin, and even he seemed to hear how thin. No, Harlan said. Blood is an accident. This, and he did not raise his voice, but something behind it made the chandelier seem to dim. This is a debt I have owed for 30 years to a better man than either of us, and I intend to pay it. You can take me to court, Mr. Ladd. I'll have him there, on the stand, and I'll let him tell a judge exactly where his uncle was. Do you want that boy to say it out loud, or do you want to go home? Curtis Ladd went home, but Eli had heard it. He had been on the stairs the whole time, in his sock feet, and when Curtis was gone, he came down slowly and stood in the hall and asked the question he'd clearly been carrying since November. Did she really have nobody? My mom? His voice wobbled. Was she all alone? And Harlan Voss, who had built towers and broken men, and never once in his life known what to say to a crying child, knelt down on the cold marble floor of his enormous empty house so that he was looking up at the boy instead of down, and he said, "She had you. Every single day, she had you, and she fought like hell to stay because of you. That's not nobody, Eli, that's the whole world." He paused. "And she had the sense at the end of it to send you somewhere safe. That's not the choice of a woman who was alone. That's the choice of a mother who refused to be." The boy folded into him then, and Harlan held on, and neither of them pretended in the morning that it hadn't happened. The thing that surprised the city was not that Harlan Voss took the boy in. People will forgive the rich a great deal of public kindness. The thing that surprised the city was what Harlan did next, because it cost him something real. He pulled the Renaud file. Not Daniel's. Daniel had died on a site Harlan never owned. He pulled his own files, the old ones, the Eastern Avenue job, and a dozen others from the early years, the years he'd cut corners, and he handed them to a lawyer named Priya Sandhu and told her to find every family of every man who'd been hurt building his fortune, and to make it right, all of it, no matter the number, no matter how old the claim. The board lost its mind. There was talk of liability, of opening doors better left closed, of what the shareholders would say. A senior man named Foley sat across from Harlan in the glass conference room on the 51st floor and told him, with the particular contempt powerful men reserve for each other, that he was an old fool letting a sob story unmake his life's work. 40 years you built this, Foley said, and you're going to throw it away playing house with somebody else's kid. Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Out the window the lake had finally frozen solid, white and endless out to the horizon. "I'm 61, he said. "I have spent every one of those years building things that will outlast me, and not 1 hour building anyone who'll remember me. A man saved my life when I was 30, and I paid him back by getting rich and forgetting his name. I'm not going to do that twice." He stood. "Make the checks out, Foley. Every family. Start with the Renauds. Set up a fund in Daniel's name, trade scholarships, the children of injured workers, and if the shareholders don't like it, they can buy me out. I find lately I don't need quite so much." He did not throw the company away. That was the part the headlines got wrong, the part the angry comments online always get wrong about these stories, that a good man must become a fool to become good. Harlan was no fool. He restructured. He stepped back. He handed the daily running to people he trusted, and kept enough to fund the rest of his life and the boys twice over. The Renault Fund opened that spring, and within a year had put 11 kids through trade school. None of that was throwing anything away. It was the first thing Harlan had ever built that he was sure he'd be glad of on his deathbed. The paternity of it all, and there was paternity of a kind, just not the kind anyone expected, was settled by a judge in May. Not adoption at first. The law moved slowly. But Harlan was granted full guardianship, and Curtis Ladd did not contest it, having been quietly informed by Priya Sandhu of exactly which of his $41,000 worth of creditors would be told his current address if he did. And Eli Renaud, who in November had owned $18 and a photograph, who had walked into the tallest building in the country to either find a man or stop being cold forever, came to live for good in a house with 11 rooms, in one of which, by autumn, the walls were covered in his drawings and a Leafs poster, and a single framed photograph of a dark-haired man in a hard hat with his hand on the shoulder of someone he'd just decided to save. There is a morning Harlan keeps coming back to when he tells anyone the story now, which is not often because he was never a man for telling stories. It was the following October, almost a year to the day. The first real cold had come back, and there was frost on the inside of the windows in the breakfast room because Eli liked the heat low and the fresh air on. Harlan came down to find the boy already up, standing at the back window in his pajamas with his hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, watching the maples in the ravine turn the color of fire. "Couldn't sleep?" Harlan asked. "I was thinking about my mom," Eli said. He'd grown 2 inches. His voice had stopped wobbling when he said it. "I do that some mornings. Do you think she knows I'm okay?" Harlan came and stood beside him at the glass, and for a while neither of them said anything, because some questions are too large to answer quickly. "I think," he said finally, "that your mother was a woman who worked nights her whole life so you wouldn't have to be afraid, and who spent the last of everything she had making sure you'd be safe with a man she'd never even met, on nothing but the word of your dad and her own faith that the world isn't as cruel as it usually looks." He cleared his throat, which had gone rough. "A woman like that doesn't stop watching just because she's gone. So yes, I think she knows. I think she set the whole thing in motion and she's nodding to herself somewhere, saying, 'I told you, Eli. I told you he was good underneath.'" The boy leaned his head against Harlan's arm. Outside, the ravine burned red and gold and the cold came on, and the house, for the first time in 9 years, did not feel like a place to be endured, but a place to come home to. "I'm glad you didn't make the calls," Eli said. Harlan looked down at him. "What calls?" "The first night. Maeve told me you sat up all night, deciding whether to call the agencies." "I'm glad you didn't." Harlan thought about the man who'd saved his life, and the check he'd never written, and the 30 years he'd let go by telling himself it was too late to matter. He thought about how it is never, ever too late, not until you're actually in the ground, and how most of the great wasted griefs of a life come from believing otherwise. "So am I, son," he said. "More than anything I ever built. So am I." And somewhere far out over the frozen lake the October sun came up over the city Harlan Voss had spent his life raising into the sky, and lit for once on the one thing he'd ever made that would love him back.